Hey everyone, welcome back to our lecture in World Religions in America. And as you can see for today's lecture, we're going to be talking about the abolitionist movement here in America, but more so on the religious side of things versus the kind of historical or typical treatment that you would get in a U.S. history course. Also, we're going to look at the emergence of the African American church here in the U.S. What did it do? What did it mean for the black community here in America? How it became not, not only a source of empowerment for the black American, but also a source of identity and community in a time where African Americans were largely and routinely and consistently persecuted to the point of death, even most times, for their association with either Christian values such as freedom, such as liberty, things that white Americans typically identify and celebrate coming from its Christian roots. But for the African American, this was very much off limits to him. But however, as time progresses, it's because of, to some extent, because of the church here in America and because of Protestantism, with much of its emphasis upon individual liberty, individualism, self-governance, things that help distilled and become codify in the American government documents like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, become rallying cries within the African church here in America for freedom and abolition. And then finally, we will talk about the Civil War in terms of religion. How did the North view the Civil War from a religious perspective? And then we'll conclude with how did the South view the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War in a religious context. So first, let's start talking about the movement towards abolitionism. And so if you recall from our discussions about the Second Great Awakening, that the Second Great Awakening, why is so significant in American religious history, is that we had the emergence of several new religious movements that were unseen on the world stage like never before. So we have the birth of Mormonism. We have the really not the birth, but the successful establishment and for a very long period of time becoming a institution in various cities, that of Shakerism in America. You saw utopian societies emerge like the Oneida Community, or you saw reactions to the political and economical violence and uncertainty from the 1830s and 40s, even with abolitionism coming about as well, the uncertainty that that created within the Protestant church. And we talked about the emergence of Adventism, with people looking towards believing that this was the time that Christ was coming back. Because the world was getting so much worse. And so you had the emergence of people like William Miller and his famous Millerites, who thought the world was going to end at a certain date in 1840s, but was greatly disappointed that the world did not end and that we're still going on. But with not only was the Second Great Awakening so significant, it's because of its creating a fervent religious and new religious environment for new religious movements to emerge, but it also became an expression of new ideas in America and new sensibilities in America. And one of those was this characteristic that we typically say within the context of Christianity, or the context between American religious historians, the characterization of postmillennialism. So postmillennialism is this belief, typically within Christianity. I have seen some of this belief emerge within Islam at certain small segments of history, mostly early on. But typically, it's a movement that is identified with Christianity alone, and it took root for a very long period of time here in America, but has kind of has gone away with the advents of the World War One, World War Two, the communism and Cold War era that was going on, that it subsequently became supplanted within the American religious identity with premillennialism, and that's something a little bit different, which we'll talk about later. But for our purposes here, postmillennialism. So, millennialism is basically the belief that Christ, according to the Gospels or according to the book of Revelation, according to church theology, that millennialism is that Christ will return at some point and that he will reign for 1,000 year period according to the book of Revelation. We're not sure when this, as the church, they're not sure when this period will be. So it's always met with fervent expectation and belief that it either will happen or has happened. So for postmillennialism, it's kind of the belief that it has already happened. That because of the dominance of the Christian church throughout history, uh, after the conversion of Constantine and the Roman Empire becoming a legitimate Christian nation in 390, that you had a long 1,000 year period, almost 2,000 years period at this point of Christian dominance in the world. And so for postmillennialism that emerged really within the Second Great Awakening was this belief that it goes back to Jesus's famous sermon famous teaching on his prayer, the Lord's Prayer, as sometimes in Christianity is referred to as, from Matthew and Luke's Gospel, when she teaches the disciples how to pray. The disciples ask him how should they pray, and Jesus teaches them a simple prayer. But at the very core of this prayer, Jesus says, "Thy kingdom come." Well, in the old King James version, but your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. After the Second Great Awakening, there was this belief that that little line from Jesus's Lord's Prayer was a prophecy and a commandment that was to be lived out in the life of the church, or in this case, within individual Christianities, but also within American society or Christian societies, that Christ's kingdom will come, his will must be done in order to bring about his kingdom. And so it was the belief, so postmillennialism, to try to sum it up, is this belief that both society and the individual can and needs to be perfected as to the will of God, so that things can get better for the individual, that through education, through proper training, through proper mentorship, with proper perspective, that a man or an individual can be perfected in this life, that he can be a better person. And so this was emerged out of some of the Arminius thinking and theology that we've already talked about. And so that soon became to apply to society, and that belief that society can be perfected. So during the Second Great Awakening, every aspect of society began to be subjugated and began to be scrutinized in order to find out where has society fallen apart and where can we perfect it, where can we purify it in our ways and our attempts as we prepare ourselves for God's final act of redemption. that it was through postmillennialism and through much of the preaching of the Second Great Awakening, like people like Charles Finley, was that Christ and God needs you. God and Christ needs the church in order to help him bring about his desire. And so they began to look at every aspect of human society in order, how can we do our part as individuals to make our world a better place, to make it more Christian in a sense. And so they began to look at things like alcohol, temperance, things like Sabbath observances. Are we working too much? Are we giving ourselves too much over to capitalism, which is in turn ruining certain key aspects of our society? That is, because we need to, everything's all about money, that we're losing time and we're competing against other people for money and resources, that we're losing out if we're not working on every day. But then how society has started to crumble at this point in the 1830s and 40s, somewhat so in America, people began to look at certain things like alcohol, the overuse of alcohol in American society. America loved its alcohol, loved its beer, still loves its beer. But then, as well, working on the Sabbath, the use of profanity by people, particularly men in this category, certain vices, whether it was gambling, particularly for a large part, but also prostitution for a large part of the period. Um, we really don't have drug use at this time. That comes, very much later, but alcohol kind of gets considered among of these vices. But really, it's gambling and prostitution within the urban centers, or then later will be moved out west. But also some kind of political aspects society began to be scrutinized and wanted to change. And so you have the emergence of the women's rights movement in the early 1830s and 1840s, but fades away due to the Civil War. Slavery. Uh, the call for abolitionism kind of really emerges in the American conscious, even though much earlier than the American Revolution War. But most people think, credit it to the Second Great Awakening as well. So starting in around the 1810s, we start seeing white people more and more advocating for slavery, the end of slavery. We also see prison reform movements beginning to take place, how American society punishes an individual for crimes and certain uh, misdemeanors. And then we also see the emergence later in the 1840s and up, the emergence of a police force, because typically societies, cities, villages, local towns relied on armed militia groups in order to police each other. And then what we'll talk about later, what happens is political division soon arises within these militia groups, and they became largely ineffective, and that they're only serving certain people, only serving those families that are represented within the armed militia group, or those that are paying them. And so they're not policing, they're not protecting everybody, or the fire brigades. Early on, that they were militia groups, people who would volunteer, but they would only save your building if you voted a certain way or if you donated money to their group. So it was very ineffective. So not only did penal institutions get looked at, but also civil services like police, fire departments begin to be looked at and become professionalized starting in the 1840s and on, as well as education movements. Education of not only just white, boys, but it became education of white women, and eventually also African slaves began, in some very small parts, were encouraged to be receive some form of education, even though for the African slaves it was quite limited, merely just basic accounting, so that they could so the white people could delegate their duties and tasks for running the farm to an educated person in whom they trusted. But eventually, up in the north, when more Africans became free and escaped to the northern regions of America, whether New York or Boston or Philadelphia, we start seeing freedmen becoming educated and can be able to receive college degrees as well. And it's all a part to this post-millennial idea that we can perfect societies, and so we must do it individually as well. This is a prime example. This is an excerpt from a letter written by Theodore Dwight Wells, who was famous during the Second Great Awakening, but he was more on the abolitionist side of things. But he's writing a letter to Lewis Tappan, who is another one of these traveling revivalists during the Second Great Awakening. And so this is them talking about how society has started to change during their movement, and certain expectations as well started to change of what is the duty and task of the Second Great Awakening. Is it still to be remaining all about Christianity, or should it evolve into being something more? So here's this brief excerpt between these two men communicating together. So this is from 1835. So this is Theodore talking to Lewis. He says, God has called some to be prophets, some to be apostles, some to be teachers. He's quoting Paul here. All members of the body of Christ have not the same office. So let Devian, who is another, he starts listing out many of these preachers during the Second Great Awakening who start evolving their message, as you can see here, because of this post-millennialism having started to now infected and having taken root within the Second Great Awakening, or really within American society. So let Devian drive the temperance movement. Let McDowell drive the moral reform movement. Let Finney drive revivals, and let Tappan drive anti-slavery, and etc. Each of these is bound to make his own particular department his main business, and to promote collectively as much as he can the other objects. But now here's this key part here with Dwight and Lewis talking. But Charles Finney, so Finney's drive is revivals. Finney has erred in not giving as much collateral attention to the issue of slavery as the present crisis demands. So this is in 1835. And so again, these are all these revivalist preachers who their message and their theology is starting to change. Or maybe this is how it always was, but because of postmillennialism, American society and expectations begin to change. And so, whereas the preacher, instead of just being confined within the box of spirituality and of religion, that he has the collective responsibility here to to capture the audience and the attention of his congregation to issues outside of the church. And so Theodore and Lewis here are talking, and they're scolding Finney here. Charles Finney, who was the kind of leader and the main icon of the Second Great Awakening. Listen, he has erred because he is not giving attention to the issue of slavery in his sermons and his revival circuits. He's failing miserably in his duties as a minister, according to both Theodore and Lewis White. So this is just an example of the kind of thinking and the kind of fervent attitude that's going on during this time in America that will eventually bubble up, and why we get to the American Civil War is because of this sentiment that becomes ingrained within generations because of the Second Great Awakening. That now it becomes your moral responsibility, also your religious responsibility, to act on the issue of slavery. And so, thus, the revival spirit of the Second Great Awakening provided the impetus for summoning both men and women to the battle against America's greatest sin on the grandest of all scales. That eventually, all of these other movements, like the temperance movement, the Sabbath observance movement, the women's rights movement, the penal institutions and education, soon take a back, take a back seat and become forgotten about almost to certain points because of the issue of slavery. The slavery and the abolitionist movement becomes the dominant thinking and dominant energy of the American church and of the American reformist movement that had started and had spread out. As you can see, Divian, preaching against alcohol, McDowell preaching moral reforms, which would probably be penal institutions, educations, and women's rights were kind of considered moral movements. Um, and then, Tappan here, Lewis Tappan himself, the anti-slavery movement. But eventually, all of these guys start pouring more and more energy into the anti-slavery movement, and it becomes to dominate the American religious scene as well as the political scene, and then it explains why we get to where we are with the American Civil War. So let's talk about the abolitionist movement. So, out of all of these social reform movements of the 19th century, the abolitionist movement greatly, I can't find a better adjective, a more important adjective, but it greatly disrupted the American church, divided it, broke it apart, as well as shook the entire nation to its foundations to the point that we start taking up arms against each other. Less than 100 years from us fighting a revolution to free our fellow brothers from tyranny, we soon, because of abolition, because of slavery, we start pointing guns, we take out knives, and we start attacking each other in a most violent of way with the Civil War. And so I can't stress that enough that, even though, later on we'll talk about in the 1960s and 70s how the women's rights movement and gay rights movement has now divided the American church, but it never has divided it more so in American religious history as the abolitionist movement. So we'll have another wave that we'll talk about towards the end of this course where it starts dividing the American churches again. But here, this is the start of the divisions, but the divisions even more so that we still haven't healed completely in America, which is it's tragic. It's beyond tragic. So while the call for abolitionists, it wasn't an American movement. It was very much a transatlantic movement that you had calls for abolitionists as early as the 1770s and 1760s in France. But later on, the 1780s, where it picks up, where France outlaws slavery in 1787. You had Great Britain that was fighting for abolitionist movement with the great politician William Wilberforce, who was successful twice in crafting legislation to outlaw slavery and the slave trade by Great Britain in the early 1804, 1807. I can't remember which two. He was successful then, and then it took him until about 20 years later to outlaw slavery, period, in the British colony or British Empire. But all of this was born out of Enlightenment ideas with the abolitionist movement that all men are created equal. That you as an African, you as a Asian, you as a American, Native American, that you as a human being, just by breathing, by existing, that you have the same expectations, the same rights that I, as a white man, come to take for granted. That's really what the Enlightenment idea is about, that all men are created equal from birth. That the moment they breathe, that it is inherently natural within us to be free individuals, to be free people, and that what is unnatural is subjugation. What's unnatural is slavery. What's unnatural is racism. What's unnatural is the limiting of individual freedom. And so you have the birth of the abolitionist movement emerging and bubbling out of the Enlightenment that inspired America, that inspired our foundations, that its roots was also abolitionism. And so here in America, very early on, you had with the foundation of you had some political leaders prior to our foundation, political leaders like James Oglethorpe, who started to lead um, a change in American society, abandoning the practice of slavery here in America. That when he came to America early on in the 1730s, that he saw that he's wisely enough saw the issue of slavery as being what is going to be America's downfall. And so he advocately, when he came to America as a businessman and then later a politician in both America and in England, he lobbied very hard to try to ban slavery, both in England, where he was unsuccessful, but he helped train William Wilberforce. This was William Wilberforce's mentor, was Oglethorpe. Um, and so he was able to successfully pass the torch on later on. But here in America, what sometimes is forgotten is that Oglethorpe was the founding father of the Georgia colony. And so while he established Georgia, he at first wanted adamantly for it to be a free state. And so in his letter to the Georgia trustees, after creating the colony of Georgia as this, economical um, venture for people back, here in the Americas as well as in the United States or in Great Britain, he wrote this famous letter to the Georgia trustees, people who were invested in the Georgia project of the colony. And he said, if we allow slaves, because at this point he was being pressured. He was being pressured by the Carolina colonies to bring in slaves, by Virginia to bring in slaves because of the success that those colonies were doing. I mean, he was adamant. George Oglethorpe was adamant that no, we are not going to bring slaves into Georgia. It is Georgia will remain free. And so in this, and he's pleading with his trustees because his trustees are wanting to do this because they're wanting to make money. They're wanting to make much more money on their investments. And so he's pleading to his trustees and says, if we allow slaves, we are acting out against the very principles in which we associate. Again, this is who we are. That if we betray our principles, if we betray the Enlightenment ideas that all of us were born within and emerged out of and that we firmly believed in, over because we want to make a quick buck, we want to expand our revenues, as he says here, it will become a distress of all mankind if we allow slavery in Georgia. Unfortunately, after Oglethorpe uh, dies, when he goes back to England and he's not able to advocate around 17, I think it's 1770s and the 80s, Georgia reverses its decision of being a free state and very much so becomes a slave state. And with South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama becomes one of the key battlegrounds for the abolitionist movement and for slavery and for the subjugation of black people here in America becomes, a foundational hub of this. And so it's one of the great tragedies of Georgia's own history that it turned its back on its founding fathers soon as he's, away, and soon as his health starts to deteriorate, they change their mind because again, they're wanting to make a quick buck in Georgia. And so they start taking on slaves on a massive scale, even more so than what was happening in South Carolina. But ultimately, Georgia Oglethorpe started a small fire in America with many of the founding fathers and within the Revolution. So the call for the American Revolution at a point in time that it eventually gets lost in the narrative that we typically spin within our U.S. history textbooks. But equally, at the same time that preachers and our founding fathers were calling and advocating for a revolution, they were also the American Revolution became synonymous with the idea of emancipation. And so one of the greatest advocates for the American Revolution, Thomas Paine's famous book Common Sense, that comes out in 1776, his very first book that he wrote that started the talk of revolution but becomes codified within his common sense narrative that later becomes just as equivalent to the Declaration of Independence for the American Revolution was his pamphlet, The American Slavery in America. And where he denigrates the African slave trade, the African practice here in America, and says if America, and he blames the British for causing this. He doesn't blame the Americans, and so he says if the American people can let go of their slavery, if they can break the bonds of British slavery here in America, and the force at the time he called it a force practice, but it turns out it really wasn't a forced practice of slavery by the British, but this forced practice of slavery that then, if we can free the black man in America, we can free ourselves. And that's basically the argument that he makes out in his pamphlet. And so he calls for people that they first need to take up arms for and against slavery, or not for slavery, but for the black man, but against slavery here in America. Because Thomas Paine gets this one line in here that gets misquoted or misidentified. That he says, if one man in this new country that we're wanting to create, if one man is ever enslaved, then all of us are enslaved. And that we're not really ever free and truly free. So until we end slavery first, we cannot be free as a society. And so it's kind of forgotten that Thomas Paine, one of America's greatest advocates for the revolution, was also advocating for emancipation. And it was it was also the inherent idea within many of the founding fathers that the Revolution War would also equal the freedom towards Africans here in America as well. And so some states started to take that lead. And so we have states like Vermont, which wasn't even a state yet at this time, it was a republic, became the very first jurisdiction in America during the War of Independence here, 1777, that it prohibited slavery, and then later on it granted freedom to all Africans within the territory of the Republic of Vermont. Pennsylvania became the first state to abolish slavery in 1780, but how it did it was it did it gradually, in that it outlawed the practice of slavery, but those who still owned slaves at the time could maintain slavery, but they could not pass it down. And so as soon as the owner dies, soon as the plantation head dies at the time of 1780, that the practice of slavery and within your particular homestead would be absolved. And so eventually by 1820, I believe was around the 1820s, was the last instance of slavery occurring within Pennsylvania. So it had a gradual abolitionist, but it started in 1780. And then later on in Massachusetts, shortly after the Revolutionary War, that the Massachusetts State Supreme Court had a famous case where Africans were, black Americans now were suing for independence and were suing for their rights because after the Revolutionary War had occurred, many of the people in Massachusetts or in other states as well were saying, well, all that talk about, if you as a black man, if you were able to fight for us, take up arms, join the military, join the local militia, and if you were able to serve 18 months in the army, you would be granted your freedom. Or if you were to fight against the British and fight to help George Washington win, that you, with after the Treaty of Versailles, you will be a free person. And so this is, that happened in 1781, and then we're having in the very next year in 1782 places like Massachusetts and New York, and then in Maryland at the same time it's going on, where they were saying, well, we take all that back. We really like our slaves. We like you as black Americans to be subjugated to white people. We really do like that. However, thankfully, a group of black Americans and a few ministers, white ministers, successfully sued the Massachusetts Supreme Court, demanding their rights and rules because in 1780, Massachusetts passed a new constitution in which the Constitution said all men are free. And so they went back to the Supreme Court and they said, hey, this line that you have made, this line that we fought against the British for you to declare a constitution for our state, and the very first amendment, a part of that constitution that was fought for by people like John Adams, who would later become our second president, that all men are free in the state of Massachusetts. That is what the First Amendment within the Constitution of Massachusetts says. All men are free. And so they went to the Supreme Court and say, now how do you define man? It doesn't say white man. It says all men. And so thankfully the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled, and they ruled correctly, that a black man was indeed a man. That is actually part of their ruling. A black man was indeed a man and therefore free under the state's constitution. And so you had successful challenges, back in Maryland and in New York, where black men were, uh, well, Maryland not so much, but especially in New York, were labeled as free citizens. And so you had this movement. And so between 1780, it's really the start with Pennsylvania and then Massachusetts later that fall, all the way up until 1804 with Thomas Jefferson's passage of a law that we'll talk about here in a second. Then all of the northern states above Maryland, the state line of Maryland, passed legislation that were banning the practice of slavery within their states. All of them. New Jersey, Delaware, um, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Rhode Island took a little bit more time, but Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, eventually Vermont. Well, Vermont was already, but eventually the state of Vermont. They all had this legislation that all said Africans here in America, black people here in America, are free and are to deserve those same rights and freedoms that white people have endured. However, everyone south of Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, the southern states resisted adamantly. Adamantly. They resisted any chance to have state legislation banning the practice of slavery because slavery was now with by this time was an institution, a part of these states, an institution that was not going to go away easily or quietly. that will eventually take a civil war for it to to try to break it to go away, but it doesn't. It still hasn't gone away, sadly, in much of our American states here. But the southern states resisted adamantly because of this. So, some of our great founding fathers um, allowed for it to happen and occurred for it to happen. So somebody like James Monroe, who would later become a U.S. president, he fought for within the state legislation of Virginia to keep slavery within Virginia. You had Charles Pinkerton in South Carolina, who was a state legislature, who's a part of the Constitution conventions, was part of the American Revolution as a congressman from South Carolina, fought adamantly to keep slavery within the states of South Carolina. And same thing with North Carolina and Georgia. So they fought resistantly for this. And it got to the even point that even some of the southern states would not ratify the U.S. Constitution unless Congress allowed for the three-fifths clause within the Constitution concerning uh, representation, because the southern states wanted to have power and wanted to have control versus or have equal power to that of the northern states in order to create a power block, voting rights. And so for a state like Massachusetts and New York that have massive amount of populations, or Pennsylvania who have massive amount of populations during the Revolutionary War, and afterwards, that the southern states who were, if you only counted white citizens as citizens of the United States, were woefully undermanned. So, an attempt to level the playing field, people like Virginia, or states like Virginia and South Carolina, fought advocately for the three-fifths clause, in which that all slaves, that three-fifths of all slaves would be counted as citizens of America for the purpose of representation, but not for the purpose of rights. So, in order for more and more representatives to come from South Carolina or North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia to Philadelphia, then later to D.C., that they needed they needed their slaves in order to give them rights, in order to level the playing field, so they can um, keep their way of life. Also, within the early Constitution, there was about 10 clauses within the constitutions that protected slavery as a practice within our own U.S. Constitution, and it was deliberately written, the U.S. Constitution and the way it was written, to be quite ambiguous on the issue of slavery, because our founding fathers believed that they needed compromise now, because they were counting on generations later to change these rules. And so they needed compromise now because the United States needed to be a strong nation. After the revolution, there was fears that Great Britain or France would attack the U.S. and take it over, or their government that they just formed would fall quickly apart. And so our founding fathers compromised. But both people like Jefferson and Madison and even John Adams too hoped and prayed that later generations would change their minds, and that they were putting all their eggs in the basket of later generations to right the wrongs of today. Because right now, for today, during this 1780s, in the constitutional conventions, they needed compromise in order to allow their union to be strong, to allow for the Constitution to exist, to give powers to the president, powers to Congress, to hopefully act later on in the best interest for this country. And so then later on, you had people like the presidents, Thomas Jefferson, and surprisingly later on, Monroe kind of has a change of heart, and they start passing legislation on a federal level which outlawed slave trade in 1807 for slaves to come here into America, and also to limit the practice of slavery here in America as well. So to the northern states, you know, they would remain free soils, but the southern states would remain slave states. And so you had this division within America. And so only the South, both Jefferson and Monroe limited the practice to only the South, and then the Missouri Compromise was hoped to limit it to the eastern side of the Mississippi, and so to really confine slavery into this one area. And so this was their hope that if they can find it now, and then eventually more and more people would move out west, they would have more and more power, and eventually, Congress would do the right thing and abolish slavery and give the rights to citizenship to all Black Americans, which eventually would happen, but it took too damn long. So let's keep going with the abolitionist movement here. So, on a religious scale, abolitionism began within many of the minority Protestant groups here in America very early on. So, abolitionism really began at the moment of conception of Quakerism, not only in England but also in the United States. So it was the Quakers and then later the German Mennonite communities that come to Pennsylvania were leading the cause for abolitionism in their communities. We have as early as 1760s that many Quaker and Mennonite communities to be members of their townships, to be members or sit on the boards of their local governments, that you had to sign a pledge in 1767, that you had to sign a pledge for this Mennonite community in Pennsylvania, that you had to believe in abolitionism in order to sit on the city council, in order to govern the city council. Quaker community, I think later in 17, no, sorry. Yeah, this Quaker community in Pennsylvania in 1668 wrote the very first document in America, which Pennsylvania is saying that Pennsylvania would be a free state. And these eventually became only certain areas of Pennsylvania where the Quakers were dominant, mostly up north and closer to the rivers, where again Pennsylvania was going to be this free state as early as 1668. And then later on, the Quakers consistently pushed and prodded the people like Benjamin Franklin at the constitutional conventions and the congressional congresses or continental congresses of the Revolutionary War to make abolitionists a priority as well. And so it's within these American communities, but they were still minority groups. The Quakers, the Mennonites were very much minority groups, localized in certain areas. But however, it was really with the revivals of the Second Great Awakening that sparked religious communities towards the cause of abolitionism. And so this is another famous example of a minister that famously converted to Christianity during the Second Great Awakening and who subsequently became a revivalist for a short period of time before he became a local congressman from Ohio, I believe. And so part of his in one of his journals, he talks about the sudden change that had happened within the religious communities, particularly up north, because of the Second Great Awakening. So he laments in his journal, Amos Adams Lawrence, that he said, one night I went to bed, that we all went to bed. And he's kind of using the collective we here, that we all went to bed one night as good old-fashioned conservatives, but then woke up the next day as stark, mad abolitionists. How quickly the change had come. And so he's writing this, I think, in 1838, but he was showing just how quickly the sentiment and the mood within America and between the religious communities here in America, and more so up in the North, how it changed. They said, at one point it was as quick as night and day, that we were this way forever and thought this is how it was going to be, and then suddenly everything had changed. And that now we are fervently, stark mad here on the side of abolitionism. And so this was kind of the context of American society, and with it, particularly in the northern sections of America, the religious context, abolitionism became equivalent to being a good Christian at points in time. But here, the abolitionist movement in America, it progressed. Eventually, most people are advocates, were strong compromisers, and wanted to have abolition be a part of the American fabric and part of the American deal, but they wanted it. They progressed in their ways of thinking. So originally, at first, many of the early abolitionists advocated for what is known as gradual emancipation, which hence the term gradual comes from. It makes very logical sense. They wanted what happened in Pennsylvania. It was very successful. There wasn't a lot of armed resistance. It just naturally happened over time. That generations, after two generations, slavery was dead in Pennsylvania, because they accepted, they allowed for progression to occur, and they allowed for compromise to occur. And that was the dominant model. That later New York had that same model, that it worked effectively. Massachusetts had that model, it worked effectively. But however, over time, there began to be other forms of emancipation or abolitionism that began to be moved from gradual emancipation towards compensation emancipation, which is the idea that was very prominent during the Civil War. That even Grant, in his U.S. one of his orders, his executive orders as general, that even Lincoln wanted this too, that slaves were going to be compensated land. Taken territories from the Confederates that were captured as property of war, or bounties of war, booties of war, however you want to use that phrase, that the U.S. federal government would take those lands and give them back to Africans, and give them small plots of land, 40 acres of land, give them 2 mules and a cow, I believe, and to be able to make a living as a farmer. And so this was the idea that if we were to give African Americans freedom, that we need to confiscate them as well for the abuses that they held. Eventually, that didn't work as well. It was the idea of many people in the federal government or the Republican Party, and wanted to be the attempt, but however, Reconstructionists and Andrew Johnson and all them quickly did away with it. And so you had the last movement, which was immediatism, immediate emancipation, and that's the idea it has to happen now. And so by say the 1820s and 1830s, probably 95% of all abolitionists were in favor of gradual emancipation. By the time you get to 1850, it was about 50-50 who wanted either some form of gradual emancipation, to some who wanted compensation / immediate emancipation. How quickly the movement had changed. But also, the abolitionist movement in America was, as I say here, set ablaze like a wildfire due to various abolitionists, because many of them were revivalists or at preachers at one point in time. But many of the abolitionists adopted many of Charles Finney's new measure techniques. And so what they would do is examples like this. This is a famous example of one of they would have um, so let me they would typically have scenarios or these meeting places, whether it was in urban settings or local rural areas up north, where they would have this kind of meeting, typically in churches, but also later schoolhouses or event halls, where they would have these meetings that abolitionists would come. And they would take this as an opportunity to educate people, but also that they would take turns in performing a display of art, because they took the idea of from Charles Finley's New Measure ideas that revivalism can be perfected, that it can produce a certain results. So these abolitionists wanted to take that same practice and to produce a certain roles. They wanted you to become abolitionists as well. So what they would do is they would rent out this hall that you would meet, and they would invite former slaves into talk, to give accounts of life stories, because many of these people who were up north had no idea of what was going on in many of the antebellum slaves or antebellum plantations in the American South. They had no ideas what the slaves were going through every day. So they would give live testimony. They'd bring up call witnesses, people who would give accounts, men like here. This is a famous example. We don't really know what his name is, but he's always referred to as Whipped Pete. That he would go on, tours basically with the abolitionists, and he would routinely take off his shirt at one point during the speech to show you the scars of being whipped by his slave masters, to, of course, draw you in. And so later, once photography became an issue, became a medium for people to express themselves, they would have blow up pictures of slaves being treated, boys being mistreated. They would bring in chains, and they would have put chains on the participants down in the audience to have them what it feels like to be in chains, what it feels like to be cramped up, to have neck braces on. Or so they'll also bring cages that many of the slave militias. These were militia groups within the South that were charged with going and finding runaway slaves and bringing them back. So they would have, typically they would have like a cage that was placed on a cart that they would put the people in that they captured, and so they would purposely, some of the abolitionists on display there, they would overcrowd the cages, so just help simulate for the crowd. So they tried all these various new techniques to get to create emotional response from you. And so many of them continue this practices. So again, we already talked about Theodore White, that he was a revivalist, but then he later turned to an abolitionist. And so he was a preacher, and he preached the abolitionist message, but almost exclusively only on that. But he would hold revival meetings, but they would be about abolitionists. And he would have education moments where he'd bring in people, bring in former runaway slaves to give stories and to give details. And what he advocated for was this idea of what he called the moral suasion, that this is how we're going to persuade people to join our cause, is that you make abolitionism a moral issue. You show them the tyranny that many of these Africans face day by day. And so this was the kind of new measured techniques that was taken from the Second Great Awakening and was now applied to abolitionist movements. And then it was taken a little bit further by William Lloyd Garrison, a famous American journalist and American editor of various newspapers. But one of the main reason that he became popular was he was an abolitionist. He was the editor of a large magazine known as The Liberator that was sent out to people, that people could subscribe to it, and that it would tell stories of runaway slaves, feature stories of slave treatments, and stories of how there was resistance happening in the South, and it would help unite everybody and give them, he would send out pamphlets to better educate people. He would also, part of what William Lloyd Garrison also did, he used shaming tactics, particularly out in Ohio and in the Kentucky area, where he would shame people by identifying themselves as, oh, he's, he he's not an abolitionist, basically. So he put out this column and he would feature stories about individuals within your certain society. So, a local businessman in Cincinnati, Ohio, and how, Cincinnati was on the border between the North and South, and so it had huge race riot issues in the 1840s. And so it was a hotbed ground between those who were abolitionists and those who wanted slavery. And William Lloyd Garrison would, sometimes feature articles about the local politician, the local businessman in Cincinnati, and how he mistreated an African American, or how he supports with his business, how his business supports slavery, and so thus you need to boycott his business. And so you had social activist movements being created around abolitionism that we see today, that's going on today with the Black Lives Matter movement. These were the early founding fathers that were taking and using the mediums at their time in order to effect change. But then there were some, like David Walker and then later John Brown, who advocated with their messages immediate emancipation. And so David Walker, unlike Theodore and William here, David Walker was different because David Walker was black. He was a freedman. He was a slave in his former life, but he became free, and so he dedicated his life as he was a preacher, but he dedicated his life to the abolitionist cause. But instead, what he advocated for, David Walker, what he advocated for, he basically said the reality was white people ain't going to help us. They're content. They're content to have life segregated. That slavery goes on in the South, but freedom is up here in the North. And if you want to be free as a black man, we'll help support you as white people. We'll help support you in getting you up to the North. But after that, that's it. You're on your own. We're not going to take care of you. We're not going to educate you. We're not going to help get you a job. Nothing like that. Makes their conscience feel better that we helped you, but nothing like that. So David Walker in the 1840s and 1850s, in his sermons, he advocated for the only person who's going to help himself is the black man. The black man needs to take up arms. Black Northerners need to fight and go down and resist and help and lead a resistance movement. And so his message took root with another activist, but John Brown was white, who wanted to take up arms. And so John Brown famously raided Harper's Ferry, which was an ammunition place, in order to get guns and ammunition to slaves in order to create a slave rebellion in the South, because people like David Walker and John Brown realized all the work that Theodore Weld and William Lloyd Garrison were doing is not helping. It's not helping fast enough. Both David Walker and John Brown were immediatists. They wanted abolition to be now. Um, but however, religion entered the debate on slavery in a grander scale than ever before. And so you had examples like in the Bible, church fathers, Catholic saints becoming sources of abolitionists. So you had people starting to quote certain passages from Paul, where it says in Galatians that there are no slaves in Christ's church. There's there's no man, there's no female, there's no slave, there's no free man. We are all one thing. Everybody is created. There is no such thing as slavery. Or they would quote passages from the Old Testament that you were, upon 7 years of, as being a slave, that on the seventh year you were to give them freedom. And every 40 years of a year of jubilee, where all slaves were to be free. All debt was to be free. Or, like again, the Old Testament that says that, an Israelite was not to enslave another Israelite. So an American is not to enslave another American. And you had church fathers from St. Augustine, who advocated against slavery, and then Catholic saints who became famous for their sources. And so you had various tracts being written, during this time. George Byrne, who wrote this very small pamphlet that people could carry within their pockets, particularly a jacket pocket in the breast pocket of a man, and that this little tract that he could memorize to be, good arguments or biblical arguments for being anti-slavery. And George Cleaver, his famous little tract book, God Against Slavery, in which he argued that that if you own slaves, if you advocated for the use of slavery, or you were not a Christian based off God's rules. And then you had various Christian colleges becoming sources of abolitionism. Lane Theology Seminary in Cincinnati became a hotbed for ministers coming out who were abolitionists because of the teachers that were there were abolitionists. Western Reserve College in Ohio, Oberlin College, the college that was founded by Charles Finley, would later become a hotbed for abolitionism. And then even the Catholic Church got in on this. That even Pope Gregory, this is the 16th here, issued a papal bull in 1839, which a papal bull is just basically an executive order, like the president issues, condemning the slave trade and made it a sin for any Catholic who profited from slavery is considered a sin. And so thus the Catholic Church's attempts to curb the slave trade, but however you notice here, the Catholic Church is just to curb the slave trade, not to own slaves. So again, there was some movements happening within the field of religion. But to, to complicate matters worse, the Bible does contain much more passages in the support of slavery than it does against slavery. And so you had basically rival preachers standing on each other's corners, or on each other's soapbox. One preacher said, "Well, Paul's gospel in Galatians says that there is no thing as slavery; all men are created equal by God, and that if once you're converted to Christianity, that you're no longer a slave." And then the preacher who is for slavery said, "Well, wait a minute. Paul and Philemon tells people slaves obey your masters, and Colossians, or in Philemon, the story about a runaway slave, that he encourages the runaway slave to go back into slavery." And so you had those fighting each other back and forth constantly. So now let's talk about abolitionism effect on the American church. For the organized religious bodies, there was a mounting difference between the denominations, and also between regionalisms between the North and the South, and it became over the issue of slavery. And they soon all came to a head really in the 1840s. And it was an unfixable rupture that wasn't never going to be fixed. And for some parts of many of these denominations that we're talking about, they still remain unfixed to this day because of this rupture. So let's talk about each individual main denomination here in America. So for the Methodist Church, so in 1880, the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church met together. Typically, the Methodist Church meets together every 3 to 4 years on a kind of grand scale. And so, because of the issue of slavery was starting to pick up, the Methodist Church wanted to be out on the forefront. And so in 1808, sorry, they wanted to, issue out a huge statement from the entire group of American Methodist churches: we condemn slavery. However, even though they publicly condemned it, reality is that they allowed it and they tolerated it as practices, but they were fine with it to reside within the regions between North and the South. So for the example is that the Methodist Church had published and continued to publish all the way up until the 1860s, and then again continued to publish up until the 1960s later on, 2 separate books of discipline. So for the Methodist Church, the Book of Discipline is like the book that shows how Methodist churches are to respond? How are they to act within, how is the church supposed to run and function? So it's similar to, well, gosh, it's kind of like its Constitution. It's the best example that, there's the Bible, but then there's another book, there's the Book of Discipline that the Methodist Church would use and how it operates, how ministers are to function, how they are to do their churches. And so they published two separate books, one that was for the North in which slavery was condemned. Slavery wasn't to be tolerated. Churches who accepted slave or had members who were practicing slavery had to be publicly condemned and forced to leave the church. But in the South, slavery was okay in the Book of Discipline. It was fine. It was tolerated. It allowed to exist. And so there was two. So the Methodist Church, in order to keep everybody together, was willing to produce two separate books that say two different things. And so a Southern minister, could say, well, my Book of Discipline says this, but a Northern, Methodist would say, well, my Book of Discipline says this. And so it created a lot of confusion. So eventually people got wise. And so in 1836, at the General Conference there, the issue of slavery became again on the forefront. And you had many abolitionist preachers like Orange Scott who came to the General Conference and who were advocating that the church needed to respond now. Needed to respond now to the issue of slavery. It needed to become a denomination that advocated for abolitionism and from all its sectors. But however, the denomination on the whole largely censored the meetings and the minutes from the abolitionists. And so at this time, because again, everything was very circulated and required newspapers. So what happened is at the end of the conference, the Methodist Church would put out a publication that would have the minutes of what everything was said and would distribute those minutes out to all the churches that were unable to attend, to all its members for review. And so what was interesting was after the meeting in 36 that none of the comments made by people like Orange Scott, people like the abolitionists that came up and spoke, none of their minutes were recorded. And they refused. The Methodist General Conference refused to publish any stories as well about what was going on. It was their way to censor the meeting. So the next 4 years happened. 1840, the pro-slavery camp was still very strong within the Methodist Church, and it forced most of the adherent abolitionists who came to the meeting and said, we saw what you did last time. This is unfair. We come and we're demanding for you to change your behavior. But however, the Methodist Church was still strongly at this time very much in the pro-slave camp. And so what most people do here in America, if you don't get your way, you take all your toys and you go somewhere else. And that's what they did. So the most adherent abolitionists decided, well, we're going to split off and we're going to create our own denomination. So you have within the Methodist Church in 1840 the start of a brand new denomination within the Methodist Church, the Wesleyan Methodist Church, that still exists to this day, but typically exists up north in New England and Michigan and in New York and some areas of Ohio, but it's typically very regionalized and very, very small. And so many of the pro-slavery group thought, well, this saved it. However, things changed. The next 4 years, instead of the abolitionists all leaving to go to the Wesleyan Church, you can see eventually the dynamics were changing. And now in the 1844 meeting, the anti-slavery camp was much larger than the pro-slavery camp and was able to force the denomination into action, saying, no, you're going to deal with this and deal with this now. And so what the church decided to do was instead not decide. Basically, they advocated for instead what happened was we advocated for regionalism. Slavery should still stay in the South. free soil should stay in the North, and that should be it, and we should be okay with that. And that didn't happen. So starting in 1844, the Methodist Church split again, but split into three segments. And so you had the Free Methodist Church, who were those who were strongly advocates for the similar to the Wesleyan Methodist group, were strongly abolitionists who wanted abolitionists now, but they were a very small group. The majority of the anti-slavery group were very much gradualists, and so they resided within what is the EMC or the MEC, sorry, the Methodist Episcopal Church on a larger scale. But for this time, the pro-slavery camp decided, well, if you're not going to like it, we're just going to leave. And so the pro-slavery camp actually left and formed their own group, which was the Methodist Episcopal Church of the South, or MECS. And so you had the Methodist Church now split into four sections because of the issue of abolitionism. And then eventually in 1853, the Methodist Episcopal Church sued the Methodist Episcopal Church of the South over the split, and its case actually made it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, because the Methodist Episcopal churches of the South claimed all the churches in the South as their property. And so they took them away from the Methodist Episcopal Church. And so what the Methodist Episcopal Church, who was the normal General Conference group, what they wanted to do was to claim, well, since you split, you need to buy or purchase all the titles to these churches, because within the Methodist Church is owned by the General Conference. All of them. And so if you do decide to split, you have to either give up, forfeit the church property, or you have to buy it outright for you to own it. And so this is what the Methodist Church was trying to do, was saying, well, you Southerners here, since you left, you need to either A, forfeit your church properties, or B, you need to pay us the bill for these outright. And the Southern churches all said, hell no, take us to court. And surprisingly and unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the churches in the South. And it was a famous case in which basically the Supreme Court said, well, we're not going to get involved in religious affairs. You need to decide it out for yourselves. This is religious matter, so they really didn't decide, but by not deciding, they ruled in favor with the Methodist Church of the South. And so it created a controversy where the Methodist Church was four groups by the time of the Civil War started. After the Civil War, the Methodist Church of the South ended in 1878. It eventually faded away and joined back with the Methodist Church. And the Free Methodist Church eventually was absorbed into the Wesleyan Methodist Church. And so now you just have typically two Methodist churches, the Wesleyan model and the normal Methodist General Conference. However, prior to COVID, the Methodist Church was supposed to meet again to decide over the issue of gay marriages and accepting homosexuals into the church. And the rumor was that the Methodist Church was going to split over that issue, and that you might have had another divide. But since COVID happened, they haven't really met on this issue, so we don't know. This might change, but we'll see. But the Methodist Church was rumored to split again over the issue of homosexuality within the church. But but because of COVID, it hasn't happened, so we'll see. So that was for the Methodist Church. Now for the Baptist Church. So the Baptists are, by definition, quite different from the Methodist Church. The Baptist doctrinal and how they're organized, Baptists are supposed to be locally autonomous groups that are supposed to have loose connections, very loose connections with each other. And so therefore within the Baptist Church, there's supposed to be no real denominational control. Every individual church is its own denomination. So that explains why the Baptist churches are so freaking weird, is because by definition, they're supposed to be locally autonomous. And they're only loosely connected to each other based off doctrine and based off missionary support and work, usually, supporting missionaries. And that's usually about it. But Baptists are not supposed to be, they're not supposed to be a real denominational control. However, with in the wakes of the Great Awakening, really the first Great Awakening, but more so, even more so with the start of the Second Great Awakening, Baptists sought to start forming societal bonds. So saying, well, we really don't like denominations, but however, we're going to form societies in which we all meet and agree to cooperate with each other. But we're not going to call it denomination because we hate denominations. We hate that word. We want to be non-denominational before there was ever a term non-denominational. And so we want to meet together because we want to better support missionaries and better support social activities. So in 1814 in Philadelphia, all the Baptists, particularly in America, they all met together and they formed what was known as the Triennial Convention. So every 3 years, Baptists would meet together as a group and they would decide as a group how best to organize and support missionary and social activities. And that was all. That was the only reason they were meeting, was how do we best use our money collectively in order to support missions, whether here or abroad, or whether to support social activities. And that is it. But eventually, as time grew on, the Triennial Convention of Baptists began to operate more and more like a denomination. So by 1844, when the convention met, the convention of Baptists refused to ordain James Reeves, who was of Georgia, as a missionary because he owned slaves and refused to forfeit his slaves when he was going to be a missionary. He was going to allow his family to run his plantation in his name only, but then leave his family and go be a missionary to help support, and it was very odd. And so the convention was saying, no, you got to most of the Northerners were all saying, no, you got to disown slaves to be a missionary, to receive funds from us Northern churches. So, um, and so now it became any kind of conventionary fund that was being used by Baptists was starting to be tied to the issue of slavery. Was it supporting slavery? Was it going against slavery? However, the Southerners felt very pissed off about this because they said, "Well, wait a minute. This is not what were originally meant to be. We were meant to be a loosely defined, loosely connected organization." And so this is not fair. You're not being true Baptists, is what they would say. So in the next year, in 1845, all the Southern Baptists met in Augusta, Georgia, and they publicly broke with the Triennial Convention and all of Northern Baptists. And in turn, instead of, they created their own denomination, which became known as the Southern Baptist Convention. And so the Southern Baptist Convention was birthed because of slavery, over the issues of slavery, because Northern conventioners were unwilling to accept and unwilling to publicly support people who had ties to slavery, whether owned them outright like James Reeves did, or missionary or social activities that helped support the act of slavery. And so the Southern Baptist Convention, which still is the largest Protestant, single Protestant denomination within America, was founded on slavery and over the issue of slavery. But I think 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, 2017, I think the Southern Baptist Convention finally acknowledged their slavery history and actually gave an apology that we were founded because of the issue of slavery, and we're very much sorry about this. And much of our doctrine as Southerners, as Southern Baptists, was very much in support of slavery, which was true because the Southern Baptists, all the way up until the 1950s, the late 1950s, refused to send missionaries either to the North in America support or talk to any Northern Baptist church in the North or out West. They actually started fighting each other in the 1920s because Southern missionaries were Southern Baptists was sending missionaries out to Arizona and New Mexico and Southern California, and Northern Baptists were trying to send competing missionaries in those areas because they were afraid of some of the social context that was going on during those times. And so, again, Southern Baptists refused to deal with Northern Baptists, even talked with them, even support them, or agreed to any kind of supporting funds with them. But that slowly changed in the 1950s, and Northern and Southern Baptists started talking to each other again, but they still haven't healed the divide fully and truly. And it's because, again, over the issue of slavery. So now let's talk about the for the Presbyterian Church, which is a little bit different. The Presbyterian Church, we already talked about that it had previously undergone its own crisis due to the nature of the Second Great Awakening. The old school versus the new school, those who were in favor of more were not in favor of the emotional responses that were going on because of the Second Great Awakening, were not in favor of the activities of the linking of emotions with faith, and so many of the Presbyterian churches started to split even early on. However, when abolitionism emerged within the church, the denomination, because it already had been fighting for a couple of years now, refused to take a position. And many local synods, which were small Presbyterian communities, either joined, they were free to join camps. Either they were pro-slavery camp or an anti-slavery society or camp. And the Presbyterian Church allowed it because, again, it was just trying to heal itself from the divide that was caused by the Second Great Awakening. And so you had prominent Presbyterians like Lyman Beecher, who was organized abolitionist seminaries into action, particularly Lane Seminary in Cincinnati, and there's another one in New York that I forget, that he organized abolitionist groups, organized abolitionist professors, encouraged them to go teach at these seminaries in order to train abolitionist preachers. And you had later the children of Lyman Beecher, Henry Ward Beecher, who advocated for what is known as Beecher Bibles. That became a code word within when he would tour and do revivals within Presbyterian churches or other denominational churches. And what that was guns. Um, he advocated that guns be sent to African American communities in order to protect themselves, or to abolitionists out in Kansas in the 1850s, where there was actually bloody conflicts between people, known as the Bloody Wars in the 1850s to the 1853, between abolitionists and slaveries in Kansas, and he was actually feeding Beecher and many Presbyterians were feeding weapons to the situation. But probably the most famous of the Presbyterians was the wife of Henry Beecher. No, sorry, the daughter of Henry Beecher. No, yeah, Lyman Beecher. Sorry, the daughter of Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who famously wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became a best-selling book in America and became the book that caught fire to the abolitionist movement, even more so within white America. And then you had eventually the Presbyterian churches were forced to deal with the situation. And so in 1857, Southern New School Presbyterians split and formed what is known as the United Synod of Presbyterian Churches, while Southern Old School Presbyterians split at the start of the Civil War to form the Presbyterian Church of the Confederate States of America. So even you can see here in the South that the divide between old school and new school was even so much ingrained within the churches that they even split within each other. And so eventually the Presbyterian churches came all together, and I think there's only two Presbyterian churches now. PCA, Presbyterian Church of America, and then there's the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, and and they split from each other over the issue now of homosexuality and the right to women ordination as well. So women's rights. So even though after the Confederates, the Civil War ended, the Presbyterian Church came back together somewhat. They would later split in the 1960s and 70s over the issue of women rights, and then eventually gay rights in the 1990s and 2000s. So, other than the main denominations, we have other movements of how the idea of abolitionism took root. So, within the Millerite community, the Adventist group, so you had people like William Miller, that the reason that they looked and believed Christ was coming again, and the reason that the Millerites movement took off was because of the conflicts that they saw within the churches and the conflict that they saw, the political conflict that they saw that abolitionism was creating in America. And so William Miller talked about that, and he actually believed that this was one of the reasons, as one of the signs of Christ's imminent return. From Matthew's gospel, which it says, Christ says that there'll be wars and rumors of wars, and so the Civil War was roaming about and rumoring about all the way in the 1940 or 1840s before it eventually took off in the 1860s. And so Miller talked about the race divide and the race issue and slavery issue within America as one of the cheap reasons that he believed Christ was coming back. Within the Mormon Church, however, the Mormon Church took a very negative stance, or not negative, but a very harsh and cruel understanding towards slavery. Joseph Smith taught that enslavement was required on Africans, that he encouraged it, that he believed it was God's duty, and that this is what God wanted, that this was God's will for white men to enslave Africans. He based his theology, his doctrine, on this idea from Genesis chapter 6 about the curse of Ham's son. When Noah, the story of Noah after the flood and after he got off the ark, at the tail end of Genesis 6, it says that Noah got drunk one day and passed out. And the Hebrew Bible, or let me rephrase this. Not the Hebrew Bible, but the King James Bible and the English Bible, they don't know how to translate this verse. And so they say that, Cain stumbled upon, or Ham stumbled upon his father's nakedness. I think that's how King James talks about it. That's not what the Hebrew text actually says. The Hebrew text uses the same word as lay. He laid with his father. That's the same word as it uses for sex. And so the Hebrew text seems to simulate or insinuate that Ham took advantage of his father while he was drunk and raped him. And so in response, when Noah wakes up, and sees what happens, he curses Ham, and curses his children, and says that his children will be slaves forever, that they will serve as slaves to his to his other brothers. And so there's this typical belief within Judaism and Christianity that the three sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, that those represent the three major races within the world. And so Ham and his descendants were seen as black people. And Japheth was European, and Shem was Semitic-looking people, or Asiatic-looking people. And so versus Ham, who was was black, and so therefore the curse of black people. And so Joseph Smith saw this as, see, the Bible talks about the curse of Ham as being a curse upon black people, that they are to be slaves forever. And so Joseph Smith advocated for slavery, and even his successor, Brigham Young, legalized slavery in Utah. And so slavery existed, and there was very few Africans who were slaves in Utah all the way up until after um, the Civil War, all the way up until the state became, Utah became a state in 1896, that slavery was still allowed in the U.S. because of the Mormon Church. Now, out in Utah, there wasn't as many Africans that they enslaved, so it actually ended up being Native Americans. The Ute Indian tribes, where the Utah gets its names from, that the Mormons enslaved many Native Americans there. But Brigham Young did have early on a few African American slaves that they had captured and had enslaved them, but there were more Native Americans than they were Africans. But it still existed, and so it explains why the Mormon Church, really until the 1960s, late 1960s, early 70s, that the Mormon Church refused for Africans to become Mormons. That African Americans could not become Mormons into the Mormon Church because of some weird theology that the Mormon Church had about that black people were now the children of Satan, and that's why all the civil wars and the civil rights causes and everything. And so eventually the church changed its position in the 1970s, but still the Mormon Church doesn't allow still doesn't believe that black people can progress as much as a white man can within the religion of Mormonism. So there's still some inherent racism within the Mormon Church, but it is slowly changing as the demographics of Mormonism is more and more African Americans are converting to Mormonism, and thus the church is having to change some of its theology. But for other Christian denominations like the Catholics, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, and Jews, slavery wasn't an issue, and it really didn't divide their churches. However, there were some Roman Catholics who, in the South, who were slave owners. The Roman Catholic Church didn't have an issue. The Episcopal Church really didn't have an issue with slavery in the South. It accepted it. Lutherans in the South. The church didn't divide, and Lutherans in the South typically didn't like slavery, but there wasn't many Lutherans in the South. There were a few, but they were very anti-slavery. But they were just so small in population, they could have been ignored quite easily. And for Jews, the Jews kind of were on both sides of the fence of this debate. That there was some Jews who were very much anti slavery, and there were some Jews who profited from the slave trade or the slave practices. So again, but it didn't divide their churches like it did the Protestant churches here in America. So really quickly, the last thing I want to talk about before we get to the Civil War is the rise of African American denominations here in America. So prior to 1790, there was no more than ever 1% of the African American population that was connected to an organized religion. And what do I mean by that is that we're allowed to be members or participants within an American denomination. That therefore they were typically outsiders and were not encouraged to convert to Christianity. And the reason for that was that there was this fear within white Protestants and white Catholics, that the fear that if African Americans, if black men and women learned about Christian values and learned to read certain biblical verses on freedom, that they would they would see that slavery was an issue and a problem, and they would go about to disrupt it. And that's actually what happened. As soon as African Americans started to read the Bible for themselves, so the most famous being Nate Parker in the famous movie The Birth of a Nation, not the KKK one from the 1920s, but the recent one here in the couple of years ago that was brought out that won a couple of Oscars. But there was many episodes where, once black men were able to read and understand the Bible, that they soon advocated for their own religious freedoms using the Bible and using Christian values for that sole purposes. So many of the missionaries, many of the plantation owners refuse for their slave populations to be converted. However, the revival spirit of the Great Awakening kind of changed people's minds and attitudes on this issue, particularly both North and South. And so there were missionary activities to various African communities that grew up and that developed. But still, African Americans that once they became Christians and became active members or became members of the local congregation, they still had no rights. Still had no rights that were similar to the white churchgoers. Typically, they were. So, for an example here, this is the inside, the famous Mother Bethel A&E Church, which is one of the key big churches in the African American community. So, for example, that many congregations up north would allow African slaves to come to churches with them, but they would be reserved to sit upstairs in the balcony. And so all the white people would sit downstairs, and all the Africans Americans would sit upstairs. And so there was this great division that already happened, and so they had to serve in the way far back, or they'd have to give up their seat to a white person and then sit up there again. So this was very common practice, in that they had no, role in leadership. Even the free Africans, who became freemen, still had no right towards leadership or training or whatsoever. But however, things changed eventually. So famously, the story goes on a Sunday service in Philadelphia in 1789 at St. George Methodist Church there, that both Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who were trained to be ministers, but they could only preach supervised messages to their black congregations, but could not preach to the white congregations, could not serve during the white congregations, but because of so many African populations, that they had their own ministers. And so both these men were trained ministers, but they didn't have any authority, and they could not do anything except preach to their own kind. So eventually they got tired of the misabuse, the mistreatments, and so Absalom Jones, Richard Allen, and various other African Americans from the congregation staged a walkout, because they were forced to start sitting into the galleries, started being sit to the very back, or not allowed to attend at all if a white person came in. They had to stay outside, and Richard Allen and Absalom Jones would go outside and minister to them. And so they had enough. And so both Jones and Allen staged a walkout, in which all the congregation our black congregation, arose in the middle of the sermon and walked out. And they walked out and established their very first black specific congregation in America. And so both of them eventually raised up enough funds where they built the first church, Bethel African Church, there in Philadelphia in 1794, which eventually became Mother Bethel that we have today. But Absalom Jones, he later, that same year, I believe too, this was the Methodist Church. So Absalom Jones later went on and established St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, that became a black-only church at later time. By 1803, the two churches had over 400 members. And then 2 years later, they formed their very first denomination in America, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME Church in America, which is probably still the largest outside the as a whole. The African Baptist Church is probably the biggest, but as a denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church is still the biggest as a denomination. But Baptists as a whole outnumber them. However, they typically weren't the first. It's typically Jones and Allen get treated as representing the first, and Mother Bethel gets treated as being the first black church in America, but that really wasn't the case. The earliest signs that we get was Andrew Bryan establishing an American African Baptist Church in Savannah in 1788. And why this was unique was that Andrew Bryan was a black man, that he preached to both freedmen and slaves, and also white people in the church there in Savannah in 1788. But that eventually changed, and the church was um, the, I think it was destroyed later on in 1803 or something like that. But Allen and Jones weren't the first. There were some others, but eventually they fade away. And you had by the 1830s, you had Baptists starting to grow in their numbers in the American South. And so 1830, that there was over 2,000 members of the church there in Savannah, and that they were forced to start the first African Baptist Association, the Sunbury Baptist Association, that had 11 churches, and 6 of those 11 churches were of mixed race. Later on, the Presbyterians got into the mix much later on, but to not a lot of success. So the Presbyterian Church was established by John Gloucester in Philadelphia in 1807, but not to as much success as the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church in the African community. So the organization of the African American denominations and congregations were not just a religious act; they were very much a political act. As you can see, in that little brief story about Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, that they were all started, most of them, if not all of them, were all started as a means to resist white control. White control over denominational life was too bearing. Again, like I said, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were trained ministers, being trained by the local minister there at St. George, but they were prevented from preaching to white people. Only were allowed to preach to blacks. They were only allowed to preach being supervised as well, and they could not serve in the church if there was white, during the white services. So there was a lot of control over black denominational life within the church, and there was very limited opportunities for African Americans to succeed, and so thus the creation of the African American denominations in America was an avenue for them to experience the real freedom and expectations that we as white folks here in America have come to expect and demand. And they were wanting to demand that as well. And unfortunately, they were not given opportunities, and so thus they had to go about and establish their own denominations. But quickly, the American congregations and denominations started to empower the African American community, because they gave, typically, many of these black ministers were the only source of education, were the only source of educated people within their community. And so thus, one services that the African American churches provided was educational opportunities for other black ministers. They became their own little seminaries where they would train their own congregants to be missionaries, to be preachers, but also to train them in normal educational skills that were being denied to them by white society. And so to fully demonstrate their ability, that now, because of this education opportunity within the African American church and the African American denominations, you started to have African controlled aspects of businesses bleeding into everywhere else in American society. So you had African American only publications being run by only African Americans, reform societies within African denominations, missional societies being run by African Americans, and then later, some of the early educational systems that would later become the historical black colleges and universities. But this was the only avenue which allowed African Americans to experience some level of control. And so, why within the African American community that denominations and churches and congregations are so vitally important, because for almost 200 years of history, that was the only source in which African Americans were able to experience true American freedom and true American liberty in America, was within the churches. And so they became a source of life and aspects. And they also became a source of identity that the African American denominations and congregations cultivated. What does it mean to be African American, to be a black man in America? It was really the churches that helped largely define that and shape it. And they fostered interconnectivity between various communities of African, American groups and black communities that were often segregated and separated because of white culture or distance and time, or by geography and societies. And so it became a way for the African community to become one. It was through the church, and we'll see that later on when we get to the civil rights movement, that the source of the civil rights movement, the perpetuation of the civil rights movement, where the training that many of the civil rights movement took place, was the church, the African American church. Because again, it was able to cultivate this special area within African American communities because there was nowhere else for them to blossom within American society except the church, where they were allowed to be truly free and enjoy the freedoms that were inherent within American society, but that was somehow, or not somehow, but was being rejected and not allowed by white culture. But however, unfortunately, the prosperity of many of the American denominations equaled equaled a greater level of discrimination. And so, what I mean by that is there's routine stories that because African American churches were allowed to exist, many of the cities, and they got restarted during the Jim Crow law as well, that many of the American cities passed ordinances where black ministers had to always carry their licensure, their certificate, uh, that they were a minister. Uh, Local denominations had to be routinely um, policed in many American societies because, again, they just it was white culture still wanting to control many aspects of the African American life in America, and so there was still became areas of resistance. And so when abolitionist movements take up and the civil rights movement takes up, the African American churches become targeted, and African American ministers become targeted as well because they become sources of resistance. However, within the African American community, besides educational opportunities and reform societal movements within the black community, uh, the single driving force of many of the African American denominations and congregations was abolition. Abolition became the significant way that black communities during this time congregated, what they advocated for, talked about, what was preached from the sermons and from the pulpits, and it became the single driving issue for the African American church and for the African American community, up until the Civil War and then still after the Civil War, because we realize through American history now that abolitionists really didn't take root, unfortunately, after the fall of the Civil War. That Jim Crow laws, that segregationism in the South emerged to take place of slavery. However, you had many famous preachers that emerged during this time because of abolitionists, or many famous black thinkers emerged out of the African American denominations because of this single identity, and that being of abolitionism. And so, probably the most famous example that we can talk about is of Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, once a slave, became a brilliant and powerful leader of the anti-slavery movement. In 1852, he was asked to speak in celebration of the 4th of July.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There's not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour forth a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
That was James.
All right. So that's a good example of, not only Frederick Douglass, but the abolitionist movement. They can see at the time when Frederick Douglass was famous for giving this speech called for at a celebration of the 4th of July, but he said, in 1852, I, as a black man, cannot celebrate this independence because it is still a sham, that it's a false narrative, that because not everyone is still free of tyranny, that you have a significant, over, what was it, 4 million, if I recall right, 4 million people under the the bondage of slavery in the American South that needed to be liberated. And so you had people like Frederick Douglass and someone less talked about but equally great among the African American community, Henry Garrett, who, preached a sermon at the National Negro Convention in New York in 1843, that he said, quote, "Let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance." And so both people like Frederick Douglass and Henry Garnet, why they're so popular is because now they go about, because of the abolitionist movement, because of the African American denomination, because of these early opportunities, these educational opportunities, and in areas where blacks are now able to fully participate and integrate and display themselves and demonstrate themselves within American society now, because now they have a place, that now, because of abolitionism, we get to see a new wave of thinking within the African American community, and that of black self determination. Stuff that we'll see gets picked up with Booker T. Washington, and then later on, Frederick Douglass keeps picking that up as well. But then later on, when we get to Malcolm X, we'll see that that reemerges again with the Nation of Islam movement, of black self-determination, the right for African Americans in America to determine their own faith, not to have white societies or white controls dictate certain aspects of social life. And so we have the movements and the beginnings towards the revolution or the Civil War. So now let's talk about religion in the Civil War. And how we're going to do this is we're going to divide religion versus how it was seen in the North versus how it was seen in the South. And so for the Civil War itself was seen at the time and still seen in the pages of the history books as a religious event. It was very much so laden with moral, apocalyptic, and millennial aspirations and dimensions on both sides of the fight, that many people, many ministers at the time saw this as the end of, that Christ was going to come, that this was the battle to end all battles, that this was the war of Armageddon, the book, the prophecies of Revelation being fulfilled in our lifetime. And so the Civil War was seen as this great commutatus of events that was spurred about because of religious fervor and religious scenery. So much of the Civil War was constantly painted and dripped over with in religious context and religious events. So you can see just quick examples. The famous Battle Hymn of the Republic, that is sung as a hymn to God. That, my eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. This millennial aspect being reinterpreted with the armies of God as the armies of the Union are now the armies of God, and that God is about to do that, with the victory of the Union Army and the victory of the Republic, that God's will is ultimately going to be done, and we should celebrate, we should sing glory, glory, hallelujah, because the Union Army was doing the work of God. Or you can see pictures like, this. This is actually an edit of a similar picture that you've already seen here of the of Washington's ascent to heaven, being taken up upon his death into to the heavens. But soon after, Lincoln's assassination, Lincoln's face gets replaced with Washington's face. And so Lincoln gets seen as God taking up, resurrecting Lincoln from the dead and taking him up to heaven. And so, very religious aspects being put out here. So for the North, the North saw the Civil War and saw the victory of the Civil War as being the Union had been preserved by God because because of America's special and unique characteristics that it occupies on the world stage. So specifically, the idea of republicanism, that because America is a republic and it's very unique because still there wasn't a lot of republican style democracies in the world stage at this time. You still had a lot of European kings. You still had a lot of limited constitutional monarchs at this time that we eventually will get after the World War One and more specifically World War Two, that we'll see now more and more American style democracies throughout the world. But at this time of the Civil War, America was quite unique. That republicanism was seen as being something of God and God protecting this value, and democratic values and ideas being protected by God and being preserved by God. And so that's why the Union was victorious, is because of God's providence and so of Christian values. So it's because God had favored. Ultimately, if you want to sum this up, what the Union saw, what the people in the North saw, is the reason why they were victorious is because God favored the Union and favored these ideas, and that these ideas of the republic, of federalism, of everything that the Union had stood for survived because it was the ideas of God. And so thus the ideas and the makeup of what was the Confederacy and what the Confederacy had come to represent was the complete opposite. And why they failed is because God was not on their side. God was on the side of the Union and on the Republic and on the North. You also had, I've kind of already hit this, but Christian ministers routinely portrayed the war in very millennial terms, as a northern victory would prepare the way for Christ's second return. So I've got a couple of excerpts from a lot of ministers here. So this is from a Baptist minister up in Philadelphia in 1863 that he quotes. He says that the defeat of the rebellion, this is during a live, one of his sermons, that the defeat of the rebellion would bring a time that the founding fathers of the republics had pictured and dreamed about and prayed for. It will come with the blessings and be greeted with hallelujahs. It will be the millennium of political glory, the Sabbath of liberty, the jubilee of all humanity. A Unitarian minister up in Boston wrote in an op-ed to the Boston Globe at this time. He said, "If it falters, meaning the Union, if they lose the battle, if the North lost the war, then all is lost. We shall stand in history as the most beneficent or the most maleficent of human generations, as the most faithful or as false in the eyes of God." And so this is how the war was constantly being seen. It was being seen through a religious prism and perspectives. And so of God either siding for the republic, or if the republic fails, it's because all is lost and Satan has won. The war was also seen as God's punishment or chastisement for the sin of slavery. And this is something that was routinely advocated by Abraham Lincoln himself. That following the initial losses of the Union in the early days of the Civil War, the war was constantly being interpreted through the eyes and the lens of the Old Testament prophets. That if the Union was continuing to lose, it was going to continue to lose because of the nation's acts against slavery. That this was the nation's sin, and once the nation had to throw off the fetters of slavery, that the Union would start winning. And so you had many people within the Republican Party, many of the radical aspects of the Republican Party and the progressives, who believed that and like Lincoln did too, that if they had not gotten the Emancipation Proclamation, if they had not gotten the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution passed during the Civil War, that God, that God was not going to allow the North to win. And so they had to break the bonds of slavery. And so for many people, a lot of people did see the Emancipation Proclamation as the changing point in 1863, as the changing point, because Lincoln made this statement that slavery is now free, or there's no longer any slavery in the United States ever. That now all of a sudden the North started winning battles and battles and battles after a time. And so it became this idea that, similar to the Old Testament prophets, if we didn't ask for forgiveness for God, God's not going to come and save us. But now with Lincoln, we've asked for forgiveness and we're starting to win the battle. So basically, in short, churches and ministers contributed to the radicalizing of the Northern war effort. The war was a bloody baptism. It was often defined as that, a cleansing of the nation's sins. Other phrases like preparing for its moral rebirth. And so this is how the Civil War was seen constantly. And here's another sermon from a famous preacher and theologian at this time, Horace Bushnell. They said that there must be a reverse. There must be reverses and losses, times of deep concerns. There must be tears in our homes as well as blood shed in our fields. Fathers and mothers, wives and children succumb to the hard bewilderings of woe. That this has to happen in order for us to experience this kind of rebirth, this cleansing, this bloody baptism that we are all undergoing. So this is the constant routine that they were being seen over. And then as one newspaper, in terms of reaction to Lincoln's death and assassination, I think this was in, I believe this was Pittsburgh's newspaper that I got this quote from, that it printed, "Like the sacrifice of Jesus, Lincoln's blood is the token atonement for all the blood shed for 4 years that purchased new life and redemption for our nation." So even in Lincoln's assassination, and it was seen as this reinterpretation, this reimagining, or maybe just looking through the prism of Christianity or through the prism of religion and interpreting every aspect of the war through that perspective. And so even till the death of Lincoln was synonymous with the sacrifice of Jesus according to the Bible and according to Paul, of the atonement for the world. And so Lincoln's death was the atonement for America that America needed in order to ask for forgiveness for its unmarginable sin of slavery. So for the American South, of course, had a different aspect. So for the South, initially, early on in the war, the Confederacy was victorious very early on in the war and continuously victorious in the war. So for the American South, it was seen as, we're victorious, therefore God is blessing and sanctifying us, sanctifying our Confederate identity. So whereas the North refrained from putting God and Christianity into the Constitution, the Confederates had no refrain in putting it into theirs. And so, whereas you look at the United States Constitution versus the Confederates Constitution, God is everywhere. And so they see that as, because the Northern is losing because the North was unwilling to Christianize the government, unwilling to, as we talked about with the Treaty of Tripoli. The Treaty of Tripoli stated that the United States was not to be a Christian nation, was not founded on a Christian nation. The Confederacy looked at that and said, "Aha, see, this is God judging you because you're not a Christian nation." Whereas we establish ourselves as a Christian nation, and thus we're initially victorious with many aspects of the war. The North, during this whole time in the South, was routinely characterized as being godless and that the conflict was pitched as battles between secularizing forces in the North. The government is just wanting to take away our Bibles, take away our freedom, take away our religion, and versus secularism of the North versus Christianity of the South. And that same dialogue gets put on till this day, even as more so. And we also see, here's an example of this is a Episcopal minister in Charleston. No, not Charleston. Augusta, yes, Augusta, Georgia. A sermon from William Butler, who was a famous Episcopal minister during the Civil War. He said that God has given us, the South, a fresh and golden opportunity to realize that form of government in which God's laws are guaranteed. He has placed us in the front ranks of the world's history and has commissioned us to faithfully execute his will. So this is how the Civil War was initially saw by the South, and particularly during the initial periods and the initial victories that the South was gaining, that it was God's blessing the Confederate identity, blessing the Confederate way of life. However, as the war went bad, strangely enough, revivals started to break out in the camp. Previously, when the war was going well, there was no revivals breaking out in the American South. But during the Civil War, when the war was going bad, the Southern camp started to have experiences of massive amount of revivals. They saw this as God's punishment upon their way of life, and so you started seeing new ways of thinking. So this is a newspaper from, I think this is Knoxville's newspaper reporting of the battle, or Chattanooga, that there's a mighty work of the Spirit going on in the camp of this regiment. Another quote is that congregations of soldiers assembled to hear the word, and many sinners were led to the cries of mercy. And then a chaplain reported that 1,000 men in his division had made professions of faith. And so this was something routine, but however, as the war also went bad, religious institutions served to radicalize women to the Southern cause. And so, as the war was raging on, the church audience kept tending to be more and more and more exclusively women in church audiences. And so, sermons, we see evidences where sermons were being less aimed at us versus them, or support, to now it was directly at women. Preachers, preaching sermons directly at women. So this is from a Methodist minister in Mobile, Alabama. He talks about it would be the women who would be keeping with the godly covenant, with their morality, prayers, and the home front support for the cause. And so women became this, religious institutions, religious sermons became directed at women and radicalizing women in order to support them. And so we had examples of various journals that we found, after the Battle of Vicksburg and the Siege of Vicksburg, that we discovered all these journals that women were keeping. And also during Sherman's March to the Sea, where he, burned half of Georgia down, that we have journals from women who believed that they were no less responsible for what was going on than the men, and that they were defending God's laws by taking up arms or resisting Yankee control in these areas. So again, the religion was used as a way to radicalize the women in the South as the war was turning bad. And so while, like in the Siege of Vicksburg, you had a few occasions where women were taking up arms and taking up weapons and shooting, or in this during Sherman's March to the Sea, women providing resistance to the armies and that were marching through Georgia. But probably the biggest part, besides number one of this idea of the initial victories as God's blessing and sanctifying the Confederate South, was after the Civil War for the South, we had the emergence of this idea that is known in historian circles as well as religious historian circles in America of the religion of the lost cause, or this lost cause ideology. And so what happened was is that many quote unquote Southern heroes from the war emerged shortly after the war and became heroes and people to identify and celebrate, and they become often mythologized. So people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Nathan Bedford Forrest, Jeb Stuart, these people become idealized heroes where statues start getting placed about them, mythologies about the reason that they were fighting for states' rights versus fighting for slavery, and all this stuff starting to emerge around these people. You know, Stonewall Jackson, particularly his the that gets the myth that gets around him is his devout piety and his religious fervor. He becomes an example of, you know, what a Southern Christianer should look like and what a man of God should look like. And then for Nathan Bedford Forrest, I know for me specifically, my hometown, where I'm from in Mississippi, Nathan Bedford Forrest is a hero. And so many of you, if you don't know who Nathan Bedford Forrest is, Nathan Bedford Forrest was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. He brutally assaulted over um, hundreds and hundreds of freed African Americans in Mississippi and in western Tennessee and Kentucky and parts of Missouri. And more specifically, he was supposed to be on trial in Memphis later in his life because he was accused of brutally killing 30 freed men, Black Americans, but was found acquitted of his charges in Memphis because that it was an all-white jury and they weren't going to persecute. At the time, they weren't going to persecute a Confederate hero like Nathan Bedford Forrest. But from my hometown, where I'm from, I'm in Columbus, Mississippi. Columbus was saved because of Nathan Bedford Forrest. That when Grant was coming down to Jackson, Mississippi, and onward to Vicksburg, there was constant battles along the way, and so there was going to be a pitched battle at the fourth biggest city in Mississippi at the time, which was Columbus. It was a river city, very vital to the Confederate cause. But however, Nathan Bedford Forrest was able to defeat um, Grant and push him past Columbus, and therefore not sacking the city of Columbus, but then pressing on to go on to sack later Jackson, Mississippi, the capital. And so in my hometown, Nathan Bedford Forrest is a hero because he saved the town. And so in my hometown, all the Confederates, all the antebellum homes are saved. There's over 40 antebellum homes that are still there. There's certain parts of the town that are still picturesque from when it was in 1860. And so he's this localized hero because he defeated the evil, U.S. Grant and defeated the evil Yankees from burning down our town. But on the other side of the coin is, well, Nathan Bedford Forrest in Columbus that he, killed several slaves after the Civil War. Because that Columbus was able to be saved, and so thus he killed a couple of people who were running for mayor at the town. After the Revolution or after the Civil War was over, Nathan Bedford Forrest killed one of the mayoral candidates in my hometown of Columbus. Outright shot him dead, and no one bats an eye at that. And so you can see this is again these ideas of these Southern heroes being mythologized, but the history behind these men is often very fraught. And so we also have this idea of that Confederate secessionism being evolved from over slavery to now starting the 1880s and 90s and the all the way up until the 1920s, that the ideas began changing, that the battle was never over slavery, but it was over states' rights, and that Southerners were combating the evils of urbanization and industrialization. And then I mean, there's so many evidences of this. Of I can't remember the guy's name right now, but he was one of the last surviving American veterans of the Civil War from the Confederate side. He went on to become professor of history at the University of Arkansas for a very long time. But he famously wrote a book about where he goes about in changing the nature, and he used to do interviews and stuff like that because he lived all the way up to the 1920s. And he did a lot of interviews, wrote a lot of books where he was saying, no, 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 this was never the battle was never over slavery. The battle was over state rights, and the battle was over the evils of urbanization and industrialization that we saw going on in the North, and we didn't want it here in the South, so we were fighting in resistance. And he helped lead the change because he was a historian, professor of history at the in Arkansas, at the University of Arkansas there, and he helped rewrote many of the history books, and then it helped cause this idea of the battle of the lost cause. And so the failures of the Civil War were instead reinterpreted as a decline in Southern values and past virtues and a lack of true commitment to Christianity. And so we see at a time there's a great fervor of of people returning back to the churches in the 1880s, 1890s, all the way up into the 1920s in the American South. Of the reason why the South lost the war wasn't because of the issue of slavery, is because God was judging the South not because of slavery, but because of a lack of true commitment to true forms of Christianity and true forms of past virtues. And so you have this a myth being emerged of the religion of the lost cause. That again, the Confederates camp was no longer, um, the Confederacy was no longer about slavery, but it was about state rights. It was about a Southern way of life, a Southern heritage. And so you have this ideology that gets entrenched within Southern cultures. But it was actually much of a political propaganda that was created starting in the 1880s, 1890s of reinterpreting the South because what was going on? The South was after Reconstruction, the South was able to regain itself, and many of the Southern Democrats were able to regain their old control, and thus we have the start of the Jim Crow laws, segregationism, and so now you have people looking back to the Confederacy as this ideal time of, again, this idea of this lost cause that was forgotten. And so you had starting in the 1890s the birth of Confederate statues, Confederate monuments being put out in order to propagate this idea of a mythologized Confederacy that really didn't exist. And so now that's how religion in the American South was portrayed. And so next, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be transitioning to after the Civil War, and where we're going to be talking about the rise of urbanization, the second wave of new immigration that comes to America, and the problems that are inherited with